our chair, Crespen, do the introduction.
Okay, thank you everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good day, those who are not in Africa. So today we're having our BBT and our presenter is Gareth. I didn't get the title. I don't know whether it's by choice or what. It just came as Gareth. I'll just maybe read a bio that I have here. It says Gareth has worked in international local government research and policy for over a decade since graduating his MPhil in applied economics from JNU, India. For 6 years, he was research officer for the Commonwealth Local Government Forum, networking academics across these 56 states with leaders in policy and practice, including local councils, their national associations and ministries responsible for devolution. He now works in local government in London. His doctoral thesis looks at capturing local priorities through deliberative democracy for human development. Gareth has published on areas of public policy and local governance. These have included academic research and data analysis policy papers, documents and policy insights and discussion papers. This included co-editing the Rootly book entitled Post-Conflict Reconstruction and Local Government, which includes his chapter on decentralization as a post-conflict state building strategy in Northern Ireland, Sri Lanka, Sierra Leone, and Rwanda, which is his presentation that is going to share with us today. In addition, he is part of a number of journal editorial teams, namely the Local Government Studies and the Open Access Commonwealth Journal of Local Governance. He has sat off the boards of a number of, he has sat on the boards of a number of academic associations, including the Human Development and Capabilities Association and the UK Development Studies Association. So, Gareth, we are going to give you 30 minutes of the time to present your work, and thereafter our discussant, Anesu, who's our higher education and human development research fellow, is going to deliberate on the presentation, and then we're going to give you 10 minutes to reflect and discuss your work. After that, then we're going to have the 20 minutes that we're going to open for people in the room and those online to comment on your presentation, questions, and any other things that people might be interested on reflecting upon. So we are offering you the 30 minutes, and it starts now. You can go ahead and share your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks everyone, and thanks for coming in and having listened. First, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes because it's helpful for me just to get a sense of who's in the room. Am I correct in thinking everyone's an educationalist? Are you all in higher education? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it possible? Are you all doctoral researchers?
Okay, maybe just to give a background. So everyone in the room falls under higher education and human development research group. We've got Prof. Mika, who's our chair, and who's our acting director for the center, and we've got postdoctoral fellows within us, and we've got PhDs within us. So all of us in this room are part of the higher education and human research group. And online, I see that we've got some Anesu, Chimwemwe, Faith, and I'm not sure of Ndhlovu today, but majority of our people are part of the higher education and human development research group.
That's great. That's really useful to know. Is it possible to very quickly just go around and hear what your research areas are? Because, like I say, I'd want to draw out stuff that's relevant. My own PhD, the reason you're asking about title, I've recently submitted and did my Viva. I haven't quite graduated, so I'm not yet using the title, but I'm just about finished my PhD. And as I say, my PhD actually talks more to human development and capabilities work and framework. Although it's obviously there is crossover with the work on local government and decentralization. It'd be really interesting if it's possible to very quickly just hear from everyone what your research areas are, because then I can make sure I reflect on them as we go through the presentation.
Okay, maybe we.
Okay,
Start.
I'll start myself. I'm Kura. I'm a postdoc from SARChI-HEHD. Yes, we've been in touch, we've been communicating.
Yeah, thanks for it.
Yes, I'm working on articles for publication focusing on my PhD thesis. I was looking at the development of students' political capabilities through student activism. So that is what I'm kind of working on.
Sorry, could you? The sound's not very good. Could you just repeat what the topic is?
I'm focusing on the development of students' political capabilities through student activism. So I'm using the capability approach.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Coming back to me again, Chris Ndhlovu is my name. My topic is looking at how social entrepreneurship enhances student capabilities and competencies in higher education using a case study of entrepreneurial action as a student organization that operates in higher education institutions. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
All right, so I am Ndhlovu, and I'm working at the effects of DDR. DDR is disarmament, mobilization, and reintegration on youth development in Northeast Nigeria. And I'm also applying the capability approach.
That's great. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Muntusi, and I'm interested in first-generation international students and their social integration through use of extracurricular activity participation in universities.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Hi, Gareth. I'm Fenella. My PhD work was in graduate employability, looking at graduates from private higher education institutions in South Africa. Postdoctoral work has included looking at sustainability in the university in South Africa.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Daisy. My research is on higher environmental education and environmental sustainability action in Zambia.
Thanks.
Hi, Gareth. Mikateko here. My current research looks at the post-university trajectories of low-income youth from rural communities and young people from informal settlements and townships. So I guess it's youth, higher education, and context of social and spatial exclusion.
That's great. Thank you, so thank you.
Hi, my name is Gloria Frimpawa J from Ghana, and my research is on the role of TVET in enhancing the capabilities of graduates in the in self-employment.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Gareth. My name is Judith. I am focusing on analyzing the higher education policy that has been recently introduced in the Zimbabwean higher education in terms of advancing human development.
Thank you.
Hi, Gareth.
Hi.
Edward. Yeah. My research focuses on access to higher education, specifically on private higher education, and this contribution to capability formation and demand development.
That's great, thank you. So just to cancel, obviously you guys all know each other and know your work and things, but it feels that there's quite a lot to do with obviously outputs from higher education careers, as well as obviously lower income and people going in, but also kind of entrepreneurship, and everyone's using the capabilities approach, it seems, as a framework. This paper doesn't particularly use the capabilities approach as a framework. I had said I could talk a bit on that and Q methodology and on this, but I was told that this was the one that was of interest. But those topics as well, if we come on to, we can draw either crossovers or otherwise on the decentralization stuff. I'll share my screen now. I know the paper had been circulated. I don't expect people, unless it's your area of interest, to have looked at it. But this will just very briefly overview. Tell me if I'm talking too fast at all. We'll overview each of the conflicts and the role of local government, both at the start of the conflict as a contribution to the conflict, and in terms of post-conflict settlements afterwards, and post-conflict state building as an activity after peace accords or military victories had taken place. I'll say a little bit about the Commonwealth Local Government Forum and the Commonwealth itself. We won't dwell on those things, but if they're in things that are of interest to people in the room, then obviously we can touch a little bit on that. There is, because I thought it may come up and it's not my specialism, I'll probably post a paper in the chat on this that you can share that's to do with the role of the Commonwealth and post-apartheid work and things. But that's not, again, what this paper focuses on. I heard there was some international colleagues in the room. Did I hear there was Ghana, Nigeria, Zimbabwe represented? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm guessing there isn't anyone from Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Northern Ireland, or Sri Lanka. If I get anything wrong, if there's anyone who's a specialist in this, please feel to pull me up on anything. But we'll run through these areas just very briefly and talk a little bit about the conflicts and the role of decentralization in them. And then we can start a more broader topic conversation, and feel free to apply. There's other topics to do with, like, pulling this together as a special issue and getting the paper published and all those sorts of more technical things that are maybe useful as PhD students and a fellow PhD student about talking about how we go about doing that sort of work, if that's useful. So hopefully it's moving. So that's kind of what I've just covered. I'll very briefly introduce CLGF. So this is where I was working. I'm currently not working there. I'm working for a London council. But the Commonwealth Local Government Forum is the member organisation for COGTA, for the ministries and the associations that are related to decentralisation across all the Commonwealth countries. So again, we won't dwell too much on what that means, but these are the kinds of areas of work that we were looking at. And this piece of work came out of some of that. So we're looking at things like localising the Sustainable Development Goals, local economic development. We have quite a lot. We have an office in South Africa based in Joburg. We have a lot of work on local economic development and the role of local governments in facilitating local economic development and that sort of thing, which I know there was some people talking about entrepreneurship and social enterprise and things like that. So there's obviously the roles of local government in facilitating that sort of work for your graduates, which may well interest. And we've got these country programs and looking at things like women in local government and the cities particularly. But that's the CLGF briefly. So a background to the research, a number of member states had asked CLGF to look at work at on-the-ground policy work in post-conflict situations, so particularly Sierra Leone and the Solomon Islands in the Pacific. After they had had peace accords, CLGF came in along with lots of other international organisations, be it across the UN, the Commonwealth and otherwise. And our work was particularly looking at the capacity building, mainly for post-conflict councils, ensuring their representation, ensuring the councils were there as part of the peace building process and not creating more problems, sort of thing. So we formed a research group across academics, both in the Global South and in the Global North, to look at the role of local government and decentralisation. And this particular piece of work I facilitated, which was conversations with policy staff at ministries and at the national associations, both in terms of staff as well as elected representatives, to kind of talk about that kind of local government story in the conflict and the post-conflict world. So that's where this paper came from. Just to also say, I'll keep half an eye on timing. We're just about coming to 1/4 now. I don't think we'll overrun to 1/2, but when it gets to 25 past in 10 minutes time, if someone could give me a 5-minute shout, that would be really great. Just wave at me or otherwise. Thanks. So a little bit on theory and discussion in case people are interested in this type of work. So some literature for you. Obviously, devolution we're generally looking at in terms of political decentralization in whatever form that takes, rather than just administrative decentralization. We're actually looking at politics and pushing down power and responsibility to the sub-national level. There's some interesting work by Jean-Paul Fagou and colleagues at LSE and elsewhere, and they talk about the idea of how decentralization produces a deeper and more subtle democracy, and how that can actually affect reduce conflict risk if citizens are feeling that their democratic views are being represented and held, and they're able to affect and influence political actors at the local level and obviously up to the national and to some extent the international level. O'Neill talks about devolution as a kind of electoral strategy, as well as obviously post-independent and post-apartheid kind of state building activities. And often that's to do with how the commitments from the ruling elites to kind of push that down. There's often to do with coalition building or otherwise to try and enable decentralization, which obviously usually includes seceding some level of power to opposition parties, right? So we won't talk too much about that. Obviously, South Africa's got a very strong history in decentralization. Obviously, elsewhere, be it Rwanda, be it Zimbabwe or elsewhere, there's obviously issues of opposition parties and power, which we won't dwell on too much, but it's kind of talking about that sort of work. Some other concepts that are maybe useful to talk about, incongruent federalism. So the idea that decentralization, if it's centered around ethnic groups and consolidated, that can often increase the likelihood of, say, separatist movements or a different identity. And this is maybe where it crossovers a little to do with education. I was trying to work out where the crossovers were a bit. So the idea of obviously a national story, how different ethnic identities are brought into national stories, into independence movements, anti-apartheid movements, how that story is played out and how people are brought along with the nation-state building activities. This is where incongruent federalism can cause greater tensions in having different stories. So whether that's the Igbo nation in Nigeria, whether that's to do with the Zulu nation or otherwise, to what extent those slightly alternative narratives are given space to flourish and to what extent they're counter or complementary to national state building narratives. So I guess there's a bit of crossover to some extent in education there. And Nigeria provides a particularly interesting case because obviously it's a very large, very diverse country, and it has the states, and the states are generally not just based on ethnic group or otherwise. And despite many predictions may have said there would have been a lot more conflict and things, there hasn't been. Obviously, there was the Biafra war and others, and there is still significant tensions and things, but it's not blown up, and the country still exists. There's a strong Nigerian identity across all communities, things across Nigeria. When we talk about decentralized units being used to marginalize and exclude particular groups, this is where councils, mayors may have taken on roles that were particularly ethnically focused, and where they marginalized, promoted their own groups and marginalized others. So, for instance, Catholics in Northern Ireland were significantly marginalized for much of Northern Ireland's existence up until the peace accords in 97, and likewise the exclusion of Tutsi in the majority mayoral areas, the Hutu mayoral areas in Rwanda ahead of the genocide. So that's the kind of work that we're going to look a little bit on in these little case studies. Other areas of literature that's useful is the role of decentralization in increasing state legitimacy in the eyes of competing political actors. So the idea that obviously at the local level, you may be able to bring together different identities to create a local identity and enable voice and contestation. Obviously, democracy is all about contestation. It's not just about consensus. It's not about just majoritarian voice or otherwise. It's about the idea that there's multiple actors, multiple voices, multiple stories to be told. There's an enhanced equitable, the argument is that there's enhanced equitable service delivery that could increase state legitimacy, and also that state service delivery often lands on the local governments. And obviously those of you in South Africa will know all about the issues of service delivery and the protests that you guys that have been happening across the country elsewhere, and the issue of not just the central state but the local state in terms of that responsibility for basic service, equal access to services, be that water, education, roads, whatever, jobs, higher education or schooling elsewhere. It may be that citizens don't necessarily distinguish where the services are but that idea that actually an effective and inclusive local government can enable voice and inclusion, and so it can be argued to help support the legitimacy of the state in that way. So very quickly, these 4 case studies. I know these are not areas I think any of you are looking at your PhDs on or doing postdoc work on, and so we'll very quickly run through them. So in Northern Ireland, the local when the Republic of Ireland got independence in 21, right through till 73, there was the ultra-unionist party totally monopolised all local and provincial governments. So the minority Catholic community were absolutely marginalised with unequal access to schooling, jobs, housing was incredibly unequal across Northern Ireland. There was suspension of the provincial councils in 73, and there was local government reform to enable multi-party democracy to start taking place. So between 73 and 97, so 97 is when the Good Friday Agreement took place and the creation of the Northern Ireland Assembly and a power sharing structure, which has to be done as a unity government between the 2 main political groups. Then there was actually the work of local governments in working together across these tensions and across these communities to build much greater equal access to things like jobs, schooling, and housing, that led the way effectively to peace, cessation of conflict, and the Good Friday Agreement Accords. Sri Lanka has a somewhat different tensions with the Tamil Tigers in the north, forming in the mid-70s, and with civil war breaking out in 83. In a long-running civil war, there was attempts at peace accords that generally broke down. The post-war councils have to have multi-ethnic representation. There's still a continued reluctance from the central government of Sri Lanka to devolve areas of trade, of policing, of land to the provinces and the local councils, and obviously, and also the ending of the conflict with the Tamil Tigers with the military ending, not a peace agreement. And so the difference between whether there's a peace agreement made or whether there's a military victory on one side also makes a difference to these to how the post conflict state setup works. So Sierra Leone, local councils were replaced in 1972 by highly corrupt committees of management. These have been cited as key reasons by the rebels for the civil war in Sierra Leone. Issues of exclusion, corruption, lack of extractive industries, extractive revenues, shared and very poor service delivery across the country. So in fact, if you're looking at post conflicts in Africa, Sierra Leone, it's much more aligned with things like exclusion, poor service delivery, and the like, rather than say ethnic conflict or identity in that way. It was much more kind of rural, urban, or free town against the elite, the free town elite against everyone else being marginalised sort of conflict. Again, whilst decentralisation was not, there was a peace accord for Sierra Leone, and whilst decentralisation was not actually in the peace agreement, written explicitly into it, it was a significant part of the state build, the post-conflict state building activities, often pushed by the World Bank or the UK government or other donor agencies that were supporting the post-conflict state building activities. And there is obviously continued severe capacity constraints of the local councils, as well as devolution. Whilst for example, whilst in name, local governments have a lot of health responsibility as soon as obviously COVID or Ebola or other issues come up. Thanks. That's great. And then come up, then there's it gets incredibly centralized, and suddenly the local councils no longer have any capacity to actually support this work. So very quickly, the last case study, looking at Rwanda and the civil war and the genocide. So local governments was monopolized by Hutu to the exclusion of the historically privileged Tutsi. Many of the Tutsi, as we'll know, exiled, whether it's Uganda or other neighboring countries. Civil war broke out in the 90s, particularly with the RPF coming back over from Uganda, and it ultimately resulted in a peace accord of '93, which then was broken down, and obviously the genocide took place with the downing of the plane and all the rest of the history we know around the genocide. The post-genocide nation building included a lot of the identity politics of We Are Rwandan campaigns, many local inspired programs to do with community cohesion. There was initially, but more recently it's moved, there was initially a very strong push against any sort of identifying yourself as Tutsi or Hutu, but there is moved in the last decade, certainly the last 5 years, a move towards that. So to do with communication, transitional justice, people saying what their role was within the genocide and seeking forgiveness at the local level and things like that. There was significant, obviously, upward accountability. Everyone is basically accountable up to the presidency. In Rwanda, very little local authority accountability to their local communities or otherwise, and obviously very little pluralism as effectively a one-party state. So in summary, looking at those 4 case studies and how the post-conflict state building activities took place. First off, the local governments had contributed initially to conflict, and pretty much it's not that local government was a panacea or a wonderful thing that happened. There were significant parts of the tensions and the conflicts exclusion. Otherwise, it was undertaken not just at the national state level, but local authorities and mayors were significantly parts of those exclusion apparatus. But in the post-conflict state building activities, they were all part of reducing conflict risk and part of the state building activities that the countries took place. The quasi-federal structures in Northern Ireland and Sri Lanka have unfortunately stifled further devolution. So often, so what happened in these countries, and often what happens when you're looking at more of a kind of separatist sort of civil war tensions, is that you're putting in place some sort of provincial level council, and unfortunately all the power sits there, and they very rarely devolve it down to local authorities and councils. So a lot of the work that still needs to be done in decentralization kind of gets stuck because they've kind of come up with a power sharing agreement, be it in Northern Ireland or a provincial government for Northern Sri Lanka, but without much devolution down to the towns and the villages area. There is evidence of a deeper and more subtle democracy in Northern Ireland, Sri Lanka, and Sierra Leone following this decentralization as part of the peace building post-conflict activities. Rwanda is probably the counter-example, which is obviously a very interesting example in its own right, in terms of how it's not a deeper and subtle democracy, but obviously in terms of nation building and nation narrative and identity building, Rwanda is a very strong and interesting case, and probably a counter case to the other 3. That was the paper in summary. There are some ideas around some key lessons for policy. I think I've got just a couple of minutes, 1 or 2 minutes, just to wrap up. So what does it mean for policy? So meaningful meaningful decentralization issues, functions such as finance and things like policing, schooling, otherwise, where local councils must be empowered and constitutionally protected beyond quasi-provincial governments. And I'm aware this is also an issue in South Africa. Obviously, decentralization is protected within the Constitution, the post-94 Constitution, but to what extent there's absolute the political devolution rather than just things coming down from the ministerial levels is yet to move forward. Trade-offs between completing political claims, development objectives, and democracy need to be carefully understood. So the issues around what does it mean to become a nation, a post-conflict nation, rebuilding from tensions and identity as a nation state needs to be understood when you're looking at this sort of work. The development objectives is usually a little easier. Most people want to go to university, have good schooling, have jobs, and all those sorts of things. But actually, the access and equitable access to services, down to water, jobs, and otherwise, still needs to be part of the analysis. Often, what happens in post-conflict programs is it's just a kind of everything has to be okay. Well, we need people from this side and that side, and bringing them together. But actually, there's very little analysis of the need. So you just say, okay, well, we need some of these people and some of those people, but not where actually the need is geographically or socially. And then the continued efforts to reduce marginalization must be accompanied by development and devolution initiatives. So the idea that across where there is exclusion of marginalized groups, that needs to be pushed with representation, alongside development needs. And that obviously includes representation of women, representation of minority ethnic groups, representation of former combatants, and otherwise, and that issue particularly that may come up of say transitional justice, where people in the local area are living side by side with people who have killed their neighbours and friends, and that transitional justice needs to actually take place in a lot of these societies, and hasn't in a number of them. So, for instance, in Northern Ireland, there's absolutely no transitional justice programme, whereas obviously South Africa's truth and reconciliation type work is a flagship type of programme that has not taken place in Northern Ireland at all, and to some extent in Rwanda and elsewhere, there's not quite that sort of truth and reconciliation type work gone on. I think the last slide for my last minute is just about additional research in this area. So there's issues of the nuances that contribute to limitations and success of local innovations. So the idea that each of these cases and other cases across the country, I was looking across the Commonwealth, and obviously Mozambique, South Africa, other countries could easily be used as case studies to look at, okay, what can you draw out from the lessons of what's happened in terms of conflict and post-conflict, and the roles of local government, both in exacerbating and mitigating conflict risk. The greater understanding of the roles of women in post-conflict decentralisation. There's quite a bit of work at the national level, but relatively little at the local level in terms of the role women play in enhancing post-conflict role of local government or peace-building initiatives, and the role of local governments in, for example, integrating ex-combatants from education, housing, community cohesion type work, and truth and reconciliation type work. That's probably enough just listening to me talking at you all. I hope that was an interesting little whistle-stop tour of conflict in 4 countries that maybe none of you know that much about. So I hope that was of interest. But like I say, I can open the floor a little bit. I know we've got a discussant, so I look forward to hearing the discussant's thoughts, but also how any of this sort of work, or more broadly my work on human development and deliberative democracy and elsewhere, may talk to any of your own work. It'd be really great to hear. But thank you very much. I'll stop sharing for now, but if you need anything putting back up, just let me know.
Thank you very much, Gareth, for not conflicting with your 30 minutes that you're given. And now we want to give Anesu Ruswa 10 minutes to reflect and reflect on your presentation and on your paper. Thereafter, we'll engage the people on the room and online. We have got questions and comments about your presentation.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much, and thank you, Gareth, for such an insightful presentation. I wish I could have listened to you for longer. You should have taken 45 minutes, not 30. So I thought I was going to double click on the case studies, but I'm going to skip that because of time. You said some quite interesting things in your presentation that I just want to reflect on a bit. So decentralization reforms boast about a 30-year history in Africa, and there has documented success in strengthening local governance and responsiveness to local issues. but your study brings in a unique angle, which is the comparative angle. So the comparative analysis, like across diverse post-conflict contexts, offers valuable insights beyond regional studies. And one of the core strengths of your research is that in as much as the different models that were implemented in the different countries are not directly comparable, but you draw out the strength of each model, and I think I found that quite interesting. There are about 3 ideas that I want to discuss with you and probably get your thoughts further on those. One of them is the decentralization models and the local context. So your article explores the variations in the models, and I just want to understand, did these design features influence how effectively each model addressed local needs specific to each context? And was there any thought into the different designs, or did it just happen just by coincidence? And the second one is around sustainability and capacity building. So from your article, you highlighted a lot of positive impacts of decentralization, of whatever changes are brought. You mentioned the issue of transitional justice not having been addressed in a number of these contexts. So what are the potential challenges, particularly regarding capacity building at local level, to maintain these positive outcomes in the long run? Or are some of these post-conflict zones melting pots that are just waiting for a day to boil over? The last, I think, idea that I would wish for you to double click on is the idea of power dynamics among marginalized groups. You mentioned the issue of incongruent federalism in your discussion. And I just want to understand a bit how decentralization can empower some, but also can marginalize others, as through the issue of incongruent federalism, where we now have separatism that is coming to the fore. So when you were looking at the different case studies, did you find any evidence that different marginalized groups participate at different levels, depending on the model that is chosen? And if that's the case, how does that look? This is particularly interesting for a number of people in this room, because most of us are capabilities researchers, and this basically directly relates to the issue of expanding people's freedoms and choices. So did decentralization create opportunities for these marginalized groups to have a stronger voice and influence decisions that impact their lives? I think when I look at these post-conflict zones and the different types of models and interventions that have been used, one that is quite prominent in literature is sort of this community-driven development approach. So how does decentralization compare to this community-driven developmental approach in post-conflict state building? And are there any instances that you have come across where you find these community building approaches have being more effective than decentralization? I have in mind Rwanda, case of Rwanda, with their Judicial court that they used to handle these kind of issues, and these were formed around communities and community-driven development. When in my short quick reading of decentralization, there are a number of challenges, and some of them you raised them in your paper. For example, the issue of fragmentation, and how can this issue be combated? The issue of fragmentation and the issue of having one national identity not being compromised. How can that be addressed in this context? And here I have in mind a context of Northern Ireland, where separate education systems potentially hinder broader social cohesion efforts, as you mentioned in the paper. And I think I'm looking at my time now. I'm almost running out of time, so let me skip some of my notes here. But thank you so much for for this paper. My two main comments, quick questions rather, that I'd wish for you to reflect on. Number one would be around the issue of long-term sustainability and the impact on marginalized groups. So I think, yeah, those are my two main comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anesu. That's great. Really insightful comments, and thanks so much. Obviously, I probably can't do them so much justice in this time. And thank you so much. And I know you've also got other comments and thoughts, so feel free to bring them in later. Anything else that we don't quite cover very quickly, because I know we want to open to the room and things. I'll try and just touch on some of them, and maybe we can pick them up in conversation with the room. So one of the first things was around kind of like it felt that, you know, the strengthening local government, the kind of case study selection. How did you come up this paper? I mean, it was quite hard actually to work out the framework first, and then obviously which of the case studies make sense. So, for instance, it settled about okay with these 4 case studies, partly because 2 of them there's a nice regional spread, right? Trying to make a Commonwealth-wide conversation, right? Which is quite hard. We also want to make sure it's global north, global south. So we've got Northern Ireland, we've got Sierra Leone, we've got Sri Lanka and Rwanda. We've got 2 countries that are peace was brought by peace accord, by negotiation, and by thing. We've got 2 countries that were Sierra Leone, Sri Lanka, and Rwanda, which were military victories, and obviously the post-conflict state buildings thing. But then obviously, beyond that, very different conflicts, very different contexts, very different situations, very different political setups, and obviously the outcomes. So it's about trying to work out, is there something that's common enough to talk about what that means? Obviously, none of this is statistically significant, right? 4 case studies, it doesn't tell you how this works. Even if you were able to do such a big piece of analysis across all conflicts, you're still not going to really get, okay, well, if there's this, then it's that. It's not about that. It's about, well, what is the in-country narrative around, or less told story around, the role of local government, particularly. And I was quite keen for it to not just be about, so we're from a, CLGF is about advocating for the wonderful role local government can play in solving most of the issues, but it's not about that. It's about, okay, the local government is part of the state machinery. It can be used for creating conflict. if you got exclusion, local government can also be used cynically by national leaders to kind of imply multi-party democracy when there isn't, be it Uganda, be it Rwanda, otherwise, right? Zimbabwe and things. So to what extent is local government able to assist? And obviously, as a advocacy organisation for political decentralisation, for devolution, the argument is that if you allow flourishing of local government that is representative, that is inclusive, then you many of these issues and tensions that can contribute to conflict and tensions can work themselves out. One of the things that people don't focus less on is the idea that democracy is a continued conflict. The democracy is conflict, it's conversation, it's contestation. The point is that you need space where that can be take place in dialogue rather than with guns, right? So and at whatever level. So if you take Kenya, and you've moved away from the idea that the winner takes all of of the presidency, and now you've got the devolved counties, and so you've got greater representation. The governors are reasonably empowered. They're important political players on the board. You've enhanced conversation. You've enhanced space for there to be dialogue across Kenya. Likewise, obviously, where states in Nigeria, otherwise, obviously the governors are incredibly important people, big political players, right? Big people, and I would say big men. And unfortunately, there are too many men. But thankfully, they also give space that some of them are now women, right? So we've now got 3 Kenyan county governors that are women this following the last elections and things. So enabling that space, obviously, that should continue. So just having the counties in Kenya doesn't devolve power to the significantly local level, except at the county level. So you need the sub-county level to go. And one of the issues is about those marginal voices. They're still quite large voices, party political elsewhere. So you need parties to be able to be representative and inclusive of multiple voices, and not just being very, very centrally led, which most parties are. Yeah, that's where the power sits, and you need those parties to be able to be locally relevant and not just nationally focused. And so maybe there's something in that, I think, that's to do with that decentralization. Obviously, in places where opposition is either non-existent or very incredibly marginalized, be it Rwanda, be it Zimbabwe or elsewhere, actual ability for opposition parties to take power and to have power obviously enables multi-party democracy to flourish, and not when it isn't the case. Very quickly on some of the other things, sustainability and capacity building. Obviously, the sustainability side is in terms of post-conflict. Obviously, the transitional justice side of stuff, absolutely significantly important. Probably more so, but the key thing that was the case in these things is just the capacity building. There just isn't the people, and that's where you guys come in. You're educationalists. We need people that are understanding of voice, of difference, of contestation within democracy, that are there running both the local administration, but the schools, the education systems, the higher education sector within that local area, that's there as part of this contestation. Obviously, be it what's going on in the US at the moment or otherwise, where are you, what's the role of universities of being a democratic space to voice competing views, right? And so right down from the universities through to schools, through to local authorities, what's their role of managing discussion, contestation, deliberative democracy activities without it having to go to arms and having to be end up in conflict. I think, yeah, I talked a little bit on power dynamics and marginal groups and things. I think one of the issues is that obviously often we're just talking, if it's ethnic conflict, we're just talking, okay, well, there's some representation here. These groups have some governors, this group has some governors. I think one of the issues is lots of people are marginalized, women are marginalized, the poor are marginalized. So it's not just about ethnic representation or otherwise, because you'll just get elites, elites being part of those parties and ethnically identified parties, and they're still not necessarily any more inclusive than anyone else. So the idea that people need to be able to mobilize at the local level, be it via whatever identity politics they feel is important, but not necessarily, more to do with their community, and they can voice and be inclusive. So the parties being inclusive of multiple groups, multiple people, being balanced in terms of gender representation otherwise, is where you start getting marginal voices coming through to the fore, which obviously you guys know more than anyone in South Africa, the challenges of that, and also the successes that have been had, and also that it needs to not be tokenism. Looking at these case studies, Rwanda's always put up as, oh well, so many women in parliament. Okay, but if there's no ability to voice dissent other than the official party line, then it's still not really democratic governance, right? And multi-party conversations are not yet happening there. But hopefully that responds a little bit to some of your comments. And thank you, Anesu, for a really, really interesting comments. And yeah, let's open it up to the floor. Really great to hear. And any reflections, particularly about
thank you so much.
Your own, other people's work that may or may not relate. And it'd be really great to hear what you guys are thinking in terms of your own research. In terms of getting published or otherwise, do ask away.
Thank you, Anesu, for reflecting and comments, your question that you raised to Gareth. I think now we're opening up the floor. Those with questions, both online and in person. Maybe we'll just take a first round, and if time allows, again, we'll also go for the second time if there are questions that people are willing to share or comment on Gareth's paper and presentation. Taking 2 or 3 hands, then you will then respond them collectively. I'm seeing it. I'm seeing Prof. Who else? Okay, so we're taking one also online. So Eddie, and the Prof. Then Faith follows. Then you will respond after they have shared on computer of them.
Thank you, Gareth, for that amazing presentation. I have 2 quick questions. One, its own human development, more especially in the context of Northern Ireland, where devolution has led to perpetual stalemates in the Stormont House. So I just want you to comment, like, what is the impact of such stalemates, which are necessitated by devolution of power in Northern Ireland, on the human development? Then the other one is kind of related to Anesu. Its own, I think you mentioned on the part of Sierra Leone that part of the decentralization agenda was introduced by other entities such as the World Bank or other external bodies. So, what is the effect of such agendas on the agents and voices of the local people? Such top-down approaches, and what effect does it have in terms of transition, justice, as well as sustainability of peace agendas? Thank you.
Thanks, Gareth. My question is also about transitional justice processes. You mentioned their necessity and importance, and you gave the TRC in South Africa as an example. But of course, we do know of the shortcomings, limitations, the critiques, and ongoing debates about the value of a TRC type process. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on what these transitional processes should look like, if you consider the elements that failed about the TRC, whether it's the debate on whether bringing perpetrators and victims together and into a safe space and hearing testimonials, the extent to which it really does allow for closure, or if it's just sort of forcing people to relive certain traumas from the conflict. So what kind of thoughts are you having around what these transitional justice processes should look like? Thanks.
Our last comment from Said online.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Gareth. I enjoyed the presentation very much. It's something that I'm very much interested in. In addition to the role that women might play in the decentralization process, do you think youth have a role, perhaps, as well? I ask because most of the times when there is conflict, whether it's armed conflict or any other conflict, actually youth or young people are the ones who are often in the forefront. And I ask because I'm very much, although I'm in higher education, I'm very much also into youth perspectives and youth inclusion and development issues. Thank you.
Many thanks. I think it was just it was those three for now, yeah, and that's obviously loads. So thank you. I'll try and touch on each of them in part. One of the things is whilst I know some of the literature in some of these areas, things like transitional justice is not my specialist area. I do know it a bit, and I can reflect a little bit on what I think things like the role of local government or the localized role is around those areas. But they're not totally my specialty. The human development. So I'll take them in order because that's what I've written on my bit of paper. So I had an interesting question about Stormont and Northern Ireland. I think one of the things actually is when a provincial government fails, which I know you have in South Africa as well. Stormont obviously was not able to be there. It actually enhances the role of local councils, right? So the fact that in Northern Ireland there was no representation. A lot of the Sinn Féin MPs don't sit in Parliament, right, in Westminster, if you know anything about the Northern Ireland politics. So representation is really, really missing, except at the local council level. So the role of local councils takes on a particularly stronger importance in Northern Ireland at that time. And one of the issues is that then the power hasn't been devolved to them, and budgets haven't been devolved to them, and it sits with Stormont. So when Stormont was, for nearly 2 years not sitting, there had to be emergency powers pushed down to local authorities to make sure everything continued working, and that's one of the issues of that devolution not being pushed beyond Stormont. Obviously, the power sharing agreement, the role, how that the unity government as it is in Stormont, the role of that in terms of creating a unified peace process is very important, very strong. But I think that's partly at the expense of the role of the local councils actually did initially up till from 73 up till 97, as I mentioned, the actual councils were at the forefront of that cross-community work and continue to do that, particularly in like where there isn't any sort of a transitional justice programs in place. It's actually at the local councils, whether it's across cross-community football teams or sports activities or making sure schools are inclusive across communities. That's all done at the local level. And it's the local level probably where the really interesting work is being done in that. And again, whilst I've talked to the specialists in this area, I think it is those councils, those stories about how the councils have brought those communities together is really what we need to showcase and have the vignettes of and learn from, rather than say the very high level Stormont story, which is really interesting. And things like Stormont and the Good Friday Agreement is used. There was people from both parties went to Colombia to talk about the peace processes there, and that influence as to what a structure of post-conflict institutions might look like. There's quite a lot of work on that, and that's really great. But I think there's significantly less on that really important role that local councils have and often continue to play. I hope that helped that answer that a little bit. Sierra Leone, I think one of the things that maybe I've played it a little bit harsh is I'm not again a specialist in the role of international organisations and the national politics of post-conflict otherwise. I think it is problematic. However, I wouldn't want to play down the role of the national parliament and the presidency in making those decisions as well, and being aligned with that agenda. It just because it wasn't in the peace accord didn't mean that decentralisation wasn't something that the parliament of the post-conflict parliament of Sierra Leone and the presidency weren't quite keen on in their own right. It wasn't forced on them, I don't believe, and I think that the work around that would be quite interesting as to what extent it came from indigenous, it came from the MPs, it came from the parliament itself. Say this is how we want our institutional structures to look like. It certainly aligned in the 90s with the agendas from the World Bank and the UN and otherwise, and it feels a bit like, say, with the agendas around inclusion of women. It's something that most people have kind of bought into generally, how that then plays out in terms of your institutional makeup and otherwise. I won't talk now about party structures and women's representation, but that's another conversation that is a part of that, institutional building. On transitional justice role, like I say, I'm not a specialist, but what I would mention is a focus at the national level, and obviously it's really hard. You do need real justice to happen. So when there's there's significant crimes committed against humanity, they need to be prosecuted. People need to see that people can't just get away with significant things. And many of the programs, whether it's the Gacaca courts in Rwanda or otherwise, a lot of it's to do with capacity and pushing it down to a local level. Let's try and get some justice activity happening, some conversations, but as you say, it may just re-traumatize people, and it's just because they're not pushing people through courts. You need, whether it was mayors who were, the first person to ever be, the first person to be convicted of rape as genocide as a Rwandan mayor, a Hutu Rwandan mayor, and so that is sort of the understanding of that. That sort of work needs to be done probably at The Hague and otherwise, and people need to be held accountable for the real atrocities that took place, and it shouldn't just be to do with capacity. We need to push it down. However, there is of course a very localized element of where you're living close to former combatants or otherwise reintegration type work that does need to be at the local level and does need to be about community healing and welcoming people, and allowing forgiveness, allowing conversations to continue. And a lot of the places that's not really been allowed to happen. So in Northern Ireland, in Rwanda, it doesn't really play out as a community initiative led by the community. It's kind of top down if it happens at all in Rwanda, and it just effectively hasn't really been allowed to happen in Northern Ireland. And so that's the limited comment just on what I know on traditional justice stuff. On youth, absolutely. Obviously, I mean, any conversation about youth in Africa, you know, it's the majority of people, right? So, yeah. If you're talking about African, thank you. Yes, obviously, it's youth that take up arms. It's youth that are pushed into conflict. Young men. Obviously, there were there's very, very interesting conversation and research to be done around the role of women in conflict and post-conflict, but also the role of young men in post-conflict reintegration, education, otherwise. I think one of the things is to do with the nation building, which is where the educationalists come in. So how do we talk about these things? They're very, very painful periods of time in most countries. I'll just finish this sentence and that's grand. So many painful periods of time. How do you talk about that? The UK doesn't do it. You know, we don't talk about the issues of empire and colonialism, anything like we should in our education systems. Most countries don't talk about their painful processes. They do talk about independence, but they often don't talk about to what extent that suppressed different groups or otherwise across the things. So I think as educationalists, there's an absolute key role as to do with how narrative and conversation can take place when it's contested and when it's also painful conversations to be had. To some extent at school level, but then particularly at, say, universities, enabling that space research to be done that's across different views of how this played out. But anyway, thank you. Really, really interesting questions. And I know we're kind of on time, so feel free to wrap up.
Okay, thank you very much, Gareth, for your time and passion. Sure that we have in this kind of discussion. I see that even if we gave you 2 hours, we did going to go so much. You are really passionate about what we're talking about. It's really interesting. I hope maybe the team or the members were interested to know much about your work with possible issue out of this platform. Thank you very much for this, and thank you very much for those who also attended online, including our discussant, Anesu. We highly appreciate your contributions and your comments. So this marks the end of our BBT. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank specifically Anesu and those who asked the questions. Really, really great conversations. And apologies. It is a massive paper with those on these topics. You know, transitional justice, decentralization, education. You know, it's a massive thing. So thank you for bearing with as we touched on them briefly. Feel free to circulate. I know the paper came around, but my email address, if there's any of these things that maybe were mentioned that anyone wants to pick up on, happy to send some papers or any things that might be of interest.
Thanks, Gareth. Thank you. Thanks, Anesu.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Have a lovely afternoon. Enjoy your lunch.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.